It was Thanksgiving. Not the warm, cozy kind you see in movies, where the table is perfectly set and everyone is laughing about the right things and the turkey comes out golden and there's a pie cooling on the windowsill. No, this was the real kind of Thanksgiving, the kind that happens in a split-level house in suburban Ohio, where the carpet is the same shade of brown it was in 1987, and the television is always on in the background, even when nobody is watching it, and the conversation at the table shifts, the way it always does in families like mine, from polite small talk to something sharper the moment the second round of drinks hits the table. I was 22 years old. I had just been laid off from my third job in 2 years. Not fired, laid off. There's a difference, but try explaining that difference to a table full of relatives who have already made up their minds about you. I had been working at a logistics company outside of Columbus, doing data entry and inventory tracking, and the company had downsized their entire administrative department, and I had walked out of there on a Wednesday afternoon with a cardboard box and 2 weeks of severance, and a feeling in my chest that I can only describe as a very specific kind of dread. Not the sharp, sudden dread of a car accident or a phone call in the middle of the night, but the slow, grinding dread of a person who is starting to wonder if maybe the world is trying to tell them something. I hadn't told my parents yet. I had planned to get through Thanksgiving without telling them, actually. I had a rough plan: smile, eat, deflect questions, leave before the dessert dishes were cleared, and then figure out my life in private, the way I preferred to figure things out, quietly, alone, without an audience. That plan lasted until approximately the moment my Uncle Gerald poured his second glass of wine and pointed his fork at me from across the table. "So," he said, "what's the latest with you, kiddo?" Gerald was my dad's older brother. He had spent 31 years working for the same insurance company in Cincinnati, and he wore that fact the way some men wear medals, visibly, proudly, with a kind of reverence for stability that made him deeply suspicious of anyone who didn't have the same. He had never particularly liked me. I think I represented something to Gerald that he found vaguely threatening, though I couldn't have told you at 22 what that something was. I think I understand it better now. "Things are good," I said. "Things are good," my dad repeated, and I heard the quotation marks he put around it, the slight lift at the end that turned it into a question and a comment at the same time. "Still at that warehouse place?" my mom asked from the other end of the table. "Logistics company," I said. Right. She said it in the tone she reserved for things she considered beneath comment. And then, I don't know exactly how it happened, because these things never happen in a straight line at holiday dinners. It came out. Not from me. From my dad. He had clearly spoken to someone, or noticed something, or simply guessed, based on the particular way I was sitting and answering questions. And somewhere between the green bean casserole and the mashed potatoes he said, very casually, the way people say devastating things when they want deniability later, "You got laid off again, didn't you?" It wasn't a question. The table went quiet. Not the polite quiet of people who are giving you space, but the electric quiet of people who are paying very close attention. "The whole department was cut," I said. "It wasn't performance-based." "That's what they all say," Gerald said, and he chuckled, and my Aunt Patricia smiled into her wine glass. "What are you going to do?" my mom asked. "I have some ideas," I said. I did have ideas. That was the thing. I had been reading, obsessively, for about 6 months, about real estate investing. Not the flashy, flip this house kind of real estate you see on cable television, but the quieter, more unglamorous side of it. Rental income, long-term holds, mobile home communities. I had started reading about mobile home parks specifically because of an article I'd stumbled across that described them as one of the most recession-resistant, consistently profitable categories of real estate in the American market. Low overhead, high demand, relatively low acquisition costs compared to traditional apartment complexes. I had filled 2 notebooks with research. I had been listening to podcasts during my lunch breaks. I had been building, slowly and privately, a picture of what I wanted to do. I should not have mentioned any of this at that table. I know that now. But I was 22 and I was defensive, and Gerald was looking at me with that expression he had, and my mom was already forming the sympathetic, slightly pitying look she got when she was preparing to suggest I move back home. And so, against every instinct I had, I said it. "I'm thinking about getting into real estate." There was a pause, and then my dad laughed. It started small, a short exhale through his nose, the kind that's almost a laugh, but gives him the option to deny it later. And then it grew, and then my mom was smiling, and then Gerald made a sound that was somewhere between a snort and a cough, and my Aunt Patricia pressed her lips together in a way that meant she was trying not to join in, and my younger cousin Tyler, who was 16 and had the social awareness of a golden retriever, just openly laughed. Real estate, my dad said, in the way you repeat something back to someone when you want to make clear how ridiculous it sounds. Mobile home parks specifically, I said, and I don't know why I said that. I think I was trying to show them I had done research, that this wasn't just a vague dream. But the word mobile home hit the table like a rock in a still pond, and the ripples were immediate. Mobile homes, my mom said. Trailer parks, Gerald clarified, helpfully, to no one in particular. And my dad, who I had watched my entire childhood for any sign that he was proud of me, any signal that he believed in what I was capable of. My dad leaned back in his chair and said, with the full, comfortable authority of a man who has never once doubted that his opinions are the same as facts. That tracks. You'll end up in a trailer park one way or another. Might as well own one. And then he laughed again, harder this time. And the table, my family, the people who were supposed to be my people, laughed with him. I smiled. I don't know why I smiled. It was the smile of a person who doesn't know what else to do with their face. I picked up my fork and pushed sweet potato around my plate and waited for the conversation to move on. And eventually it did, the way conversations do. And by the time dessert came out, nobody was talking about me anymore. I left before the pie was cut. I drove home in the dark, and I sat in my car in the parking lot of my apartment complex for probably 20 minutes before I went inside. And I took out one of my real estate notebooks, and I wrote down what my dad had said, the exact words, or as close as I could remember them, and I drew a small box around them. I put a post-it note on my computer monitor that night. It said, Trailer Park, 47 lots, Arizona. I didn't know why I picked those specifics. I think I just needed something concrete to aim at. That was November 14th. 11 years later, almost to the week, I signed the closing documents on Sycamore Ridge Mobile Home Community in Maricopa County, Arizona. 47 lots. But first let me tell you what the 11 years in between actually look like, because I think that's the part nobody tells you about. The long middle part. The part between the moment you decide and the moment it happens. Where everything is slow and hard, and there's nobody clapping for you yet, and you start to wonder more times than you'd like to admit whether the people who laughed at the dinner table were actually right. I want to tell you about the first year, because the first year was the worst one. After Thanksgiving, I went back to my apartment, a one-bedroom place in Westerville that I was renting for $740 a month, and I spent about a week doing what I think of now as productive panic. I made lists. I reorganized my notebooks. I read everything I could find about mobile home parks, about real estate licensing, about how people with no capital and no connections broke into the investing world. I drank a lot of coffee. I slept badly. And then, gradually the panic settled into something more functional, and I started taking actual steps. The first step was getting my real estate license. I didn't want to be an agent. That was never the goal, but I understood that if I was going to work in real estate, even on the investing side, having a license would give me access to the MLS, to professional networks, to the vocabulary and credibility I needed to be taken seriously. So I enrolled in a licensing course at a community college extension program, paid for it with part of my severance, and started going to class 3 nights a week. I also needed income, obviously. I got a job at a property management company, a small one, family-owned, that managed about 200 residential units in the Columbus metro area. The pay was not impressive, $15 an hour to start, which in Ohio in that period was survivable if you were careful. But the education was extraordinary. Within 3 months I was doing tenant screenings, handling maintenance coordination, sitting in on lease negotiations. I was watching how money moved in and out of properties. I was understanding in a practical and immediate way the difference between a well-run property and a poorly run one. I called my parents exactly once during this period. My mom answered. She asked how I was doing. I said I was working in property management and studying for my real estate license. She said, "Oh, that's nice, honey," in the tone she used when she meant that sounds like something you'll quit in 3 months. I asked about my dad. She said he was fine, he was watching the game. I said okay. She said okay. We hung up. That was February. I didn't call again until Christmas, and that conversation was short, about 4 minutes, mostly logistics about whether I was coming home for the holidays. I said no. She said okay. My dad said something in the background that I couldn't quite make out. I said I had to go. That was it. I am not telling you this to make my parents sound like monsters. That's not the point. And it's not entirely accurate either. They were not cruel people in a cinematic way. They didn't scream at me. They didn't throw things. They weren't abusive in the ways that would make this a different kind of story. They were simply people who had a fixed idea of what I was, and they were not particularly interested in revising it. My dad had worked for 26 years in manufacturing management. He had a pension and a paid-off house and a very specific understanding of how people built stable lives, and I did not fit that understanding. And so he had decided somewhere along the way that I was not going to amount to much, not because he wanted me to fail, I don't think, but simply because he couldn't picture me succeeding in a way he recognized. That's its own kind of damage. I want to be honest about that. There is something about being unable to picture yourself succeeding, because the people who made you cannot picture it either, that is very hard to describe to someone who hasn't felt it. It's not the same as being told you're worthless. It's more like being told, very gently and consistently, that you exist in a particular box. And the box is fine, the box is acceptable, but it has a lid on it, and the lid is permanent. And after a while, you stop looking up. I had to learn to look up. That's what the first year was really about. I got my real estate license in April. My licensing exam was on a Tuesday morning. I drove to the testing center alone, sat in a room with 17 other people, and completed the exam in about 45 minutes. I passed on the first try. I texted nobody when I found out because I had nobody to text who would understand why it mattered. I went to a diner by myself and ordered eggs and hash browns and sat in a booth by the window and read a book about commercial property valuation while I ate, and that was how I celebrated. I kept working at the property management company. I negotiated a small raise, $17.50, after 6 months, and used every extra dollar to pay down the credit card debt I had accumulated during my layoff period. I opened a separate savings account and started putting money in it every month, even if the amount was small. $20, $40, 1 month. After I picked up some overtime covering for a coworker who had surgery, I put in $300, and I stared at the total in my banking app for a long time. It wasn't much. It was a start. I also started going to a local real estate investors meetup, one of those informal, first Thursday of the month gatherings at a hotel conference room where people eat bad catering food and exchange business cards and talk about cap rates and cash-on-cash returns. The first time I went, I was the youngest person in the room by about 15 years, and I was wearing a sport coat I'd bought at Goodwill, and I knew approximately 7% of what everyone else seemed to know, and I stood near the back and listened and tried to absorb as much as possible while appearing as if I belonged there. I kept going, every month, for 2 years. The thing about those meetups that nobody tells you is that they're not really about the meetings. The meeting itself, the speaker, the presentation, the formal part, the value is in the conversations that happen before and after. The relationships you build over months of consistent showing up, the moment when someone who has been watching you come back every month finally stops treating you like a newcomer and starts treating you like a peer. That moment happened for me about 14 months in, when a man named Dennis Kaufman, who owned a portfolio of 12 mobile home parks across the Midwest and was something of a legend in that small world, stopped me after a meeting and said, "You always take notes. Most people don't take notes." "I like to take notes," I said. "What's your interest area?" he asked. "Mobile home communities," I said. I had learned by then not to call them trailer parks in professional settings. The terminology matters. He looked at me for a moment, and then he said, "Come get coffee with me Thursday." That coffee meeting lasted 3 hours. Dennis was 61 years old at the time. He had started buying mobile home parks in the late 1990s, before it became fashionable, before the institutional investors discovered it, by finding distressed properties and turning them around through operational improvements rather than massive capital investment. He was not flashy. He drove a 10-year-old pickup truck. He wore New Balance sneakers and flannel shirts. He was also, I would learn, worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $12 million. He asked me about my background, my finances, my goals. I was honest about all of it. The layoffs, the small savings account, the post-it note on my monitor, the Thanksgiving dinner. When I got to the Thanksgiving dinner, he smiled, not a mean smile, but a knowing one. My father told me I was too stupid to own a business, he said. I have a framed photo of his face at the closing of my 8th park. He didn't offer me a job. He didn't offer me money. What he offered me over the following months was access to his network, to his deals in progress, to his way of thinking about the business. He forwarded me listings he thought were interesting, not because he wanted to buy them, but because he thought the exercise of analyzing them would be good for me. He answered my questions over text at odd hours with the patience of a man who understood that knowledge is only useful if you pass it on. I want to be careful here not to make this sound like a fairy tale. Like I found a mentor and everything became easy. It didn't become easy. Dennis's generosity was real, but it wasn't a shortcut. I still had to do the work. I still had to build the capital. I still had to figure out on my own how to go from knowing a lot about something to actually doing it. But he changed the trajectory. There's no honest way to tell this story without saying that. Year 2. I switched jobs. A larger property management company recruited me. They'd seen my license, heard about me through someone in the Meetup network, and offered me a salaried position as an assistant property manager at $22 an hour with benefits. I took it immediately. The portfolio I was managing was bigger, 430 units across 6 properties. More complexity, more responsibility, more learning. I also started doing something that felt absurd at the time and became one of the most important habits of my professional life. I started underwriting deals I couldn't afford. What that means, for anyone unfamiliar with real estate finance, is this. I would find mobile home park listings, real listings, actual properties on the market, and I would do the full financial analysis on them. I would research the local market, calculate the income and expenses, estimate the value based on the capitalization rate, model out what the returns would look like at different purchase prices. I would spend 8 to 10 hours on a single property analysis, building spreadsheets, cross-referencing data, working through scenarios. And then I would do nothing with the analysis, because I couldn't afford to buy the property. But here's what that practice gave me. By the time I had the money to buy something, I had already analyzed hundreds of deals. I had developed an instinct for what a good deal looked like versus a bad one. I had made every spreadsheet mistake possible on imaginary money, rather than real money. I had built a skill that most people in my position didn't have, because most people in my position didn't have the patience to practice something they couldn't immediately use. Dennis reviewed some of my analyses. He corrected my errors. He pushed back on my assumptions. He taught me that the most dangerous number in a real estate underwriting spreadsheet is always the vacancy rate, that people systematically underestimate how many units will be empty at any given time, because optimism is the natural enemy of accurate financial modeling. Assume it's worse than you think, he said, and then assume it's a little worse than that. I wrote that down. My savings account was growing slowly. By the end of year 2, I had about $14,000 set aside. Not enough to buy anything, but enough to feel real. I could feel the number in my chest in a way I couldn't when it was $4,000 or $6,000. $14,000 felt like proof that I was actually doing this, that the trajectory was real, that I wasn't just a person with notebooks and plans. I also, in year 2, had an experience that I think about often even now. My cousin Tyler, the 16-year-old from the Thanksgiving table, the one who had laughed at me, turned 18 and decided he wanted to flip houses. He'd watched some YouTube videos apparently. He called me out of the blue in March and asked if I could meet up and tell him how to get started. I thought about that call for a long time before I returned it. I did call him back. I met him for lunch. I spent 2 hours explaining the basics of real estate investing, the importance of education before action, the risks of over-leveraging on a flip. He nodded along and asked questions and seemed genuinely interested. 3 months later, I found out through my mom that Tyler had borrowed $12,000 from my Uncle Gerald and put it into a house flip with a friend of his from high school. And 6 months after that, the project had fallen apart, and he'd lost most of the money. I'm not saying that to be cruel about Tyler. He was 18, and 18-year-olds do impulsive things, and he learned from it. But I think about the contrast sometimes, the difference between the discipline of doing the work slowly, building the foundation carefully, and the impulse to skip to the exciting part. The exciting part is always closer to the end. You have to earn your way there. Year 3. In year 3, 2 things happened that changed everything. The first was that I got promoted. The property management company made me a full property manager, responsible for a portfolio of 600 units and a small team of 2 maintenance coordinators and an administrative assistant. My salary went to $58,000. In Ohio, that was comfortable. Not rich, comfortable. Enough to save more aggressively and still live like a person, rather than a monk. The second was that Dennis called me in October and told me he was looking at a deal he didn't want to do alone. It was a small mobile home park in rural Indiana, 32 lots. The owner was elderly, in poor health, and wanted to sell quickly. The property was distressed. About a third of the lots were vacant. Several of the occupied units had deferred maintenance issues. The infrastructure was aging, but the bones were solid, and the market fundamentals for the area were decent. Dennis had run the numbers and believed it could be turned around in 18 to 24 months, with disciplined operational management and targeted capital improvements. He wanted to know if I wanted to be his operating partner. I want to describe what I felt when he said that, because I think it's important. I had been building toward this moment for 3 years. I had studied for it, practiced for it, saved for it, and yet when it arrived, my immediate involuntary reaction was terror. Real terror, the kind that lives in your stomach rather than your head. Because this was no longer a spreadsheet exercise. This was real money. My real money, the savings I had built dollar by dollar over 3 years, plus whatever I could pull together in capital, going into a real piece of real property with real consequences if I got it wrong. I called Dennis back the next morning and said yes. We structured the deal as a partnership. Dennis would provide the majority of the acquisition capital. I would contribute what I could. I put in $22,000, essentially everything I had, and I would serve as the operational lead, the person on the ground managing the turnaround. Dennis would be the senior partner. The profits, if there were profits, would split accordingly. I drove out to the property on a Saturday morning in November. It was called Riverside Terrace, which was a generous name for a collection of 32 lots on a flat piece of land outside a town of about 4,000 people in central Indiana, where the view was primarily of a drainage ditch and a soybean field. Several of the units were clearly vacant, dark windows, overgrown lots, one with a tarp covering a section of the roof that had presumably been damaged at some point and never properly repaired. The roads through the property were gravel and badly rutted. The clubhouse, which was listed as an amenity in the property description, was a 12 by 20 room with paneled walls and a broken water heater. I sat in my car for a long time, looking at it. And then I thought about the post-it note on my monitor at home. I thought about what my dad had said at Thanksgiving, 3 years before. I thought about the 2 notebooks I had filled with research and the hundreds of hours of analysis I had done, and the 3 years of showing up to those meetups, and the patience I had tried to build. I got out of the car, and I started walking the property and taking notes. The turnaround of Riverside Terrace took 21 months. I am going to tell you about it in some detail, because I think the detail matters, because the gap between I invested in a mobile home park and the investment worked is filled with a very specific kind of work that most success stories skip over, and I don't want to skip over it. The first thing I did was talk to every current resident, all 21 occupied units. I knocked on doors, introduced myself, explained that I was the new operating partner, asked how things were going, asked what problems needed to be fixed, wrote everything down. This is not a complicated strategy. Most people in property management don't do it because it takes time and because conversations with tenants about property problems are sometimes uncomfortable. But you cannot manage something you don't understand, and the people who live somewhere understand it better than anyone. What I learned in those conversations: 3 units had significant water intrusion issues that the previous owner had been promising to fix for over a year. 2 residents were paying below market rent because they had verbal agreements with the previous owner that were never documented. 1 resident had a brother in town who did HVAC work, and had been informally maintaining the heating systems for half the park in exchange for a small monthly credit, an arrangement that was informal, undocumented, and actually pretty valuable if properly formalized. I fixed the water intrusion issues within 60 days using a licensed contractor. It cost more than I wanted to spend. I did it anyway, because tenants who trust that their issues will be addressed stay longer, and tenant retention is the most underrated metric in rental property management. I formalized the agreement with the HVAC brother, his name was Randy, and put it in writing with a clear scope of work and a fair monthly credit. Randy was reliable and skilled, and became one of the most valuable relationships I had at the property. I went to work on filling the vacant lots. This is the hard part of mobile home park investing, that the instructional content tends to gloss over. Vacant lots don't generate income, obviously, but they also tend to be a drag on the community as a whole. Vacant spaces attract trash, reduce curb appeal, signal to potential residents that the park has problems. Filling them requires either finding people who want to bring their own units, or, more commonly, acquiring units and bringing them in yourself, which requires capital. Dennis and I had set aside a capital reserve for lot development. I was disciplined about it, spending only on units where the math worked, where the projected rental income justified the acquisition and setup cost. I found 3 units at estate auction, older homes, perfectly livable, but unwanted after estate sales, and had them transported and set up on 3 of our empty lots. Within 2 months, all 3 were occupied. By month 12, we had gone from 21 occupied lots to 27. Still not full, but moving in the right direction. The financials were improving, but slowly. We were not yet cash flow positive on a monthly basis. The capital improvements and lot development costs were eating into the operating income. Dennis, to his credit, was patient. We had modeled this. We knew the inflection point was somewhere in months 14 to 18, when the new rental income from the additional occupied lots would start to outpace the ongoing improvement costs. Month 14, we hit positive cash flow, but the number was positive, and I stared at it on my spreadsheet the way I had stared at my savings account total when it first hit $14,000, with the feeling that something real had happened, that the abstract idea had become a concrete fact. Month 21, Dennis and I sat down and looked at what we had. The park was at 30 occupied lots, not full but close enough. The infrastructure issues were resolved. The occupancy was stable and the tenant base was solid. We had increased the average rent slightly as part of a lease renewal process, staying within market rates for the area. The property, which we had acquired at a price that reflected its distressed condition, could now be valued at a significantly higher figure based on its improved income stream. We had options. We could sell, we could refinance, pull out some of the equity we had created, and use it to invest elsewhere. Or we could hold, continuing to collect income while the property appreciated. We decided to do a cash-out refinance. We pulled out enough equity to give me a return of approximately 140% on my initial $22,000 investment. I deposited the check on a Thursday morning in August. I sat in my car outside the bank and called my parents. My mom answered. My dad was home. He picked up the extension. I did not tell them about the check. I did not tell them about the property, or Dennis, or any of it. I just said I was thinking of them and wanted to say hello. We talked for about 10 minutes about ordinary things: my mom's garden, my dad's fantasy football team, a cousin's upcoming wedding. When we hung up, I sat there for another few minutes, and then I put the car in gear and went back to work. The point was what came next. I want to pause here and talk about something I haven't mentioned yet, because I think it's one of the most important parts of this story, and it's the part that doesn't fit neatly into any of the categories people use when they tell stories like this one. I went to therapy. I started going in year 3, not long before the Indiana deal closed. I want to be honest about why. I was struggling. Not financially. By that point, the financial picture was genuinely improving. I was struggling with something harder to name. I was struggling with the way that my family's opinion of me had taken up permanent residence in the back of my mind. The way I could be doing well, genuinely, measurably well, and still hear my dad's voice at that Thanksgiving table. Still feel the specific shame of being laughed at by the people who were supposed to believe in you. I was also struggling with anger. I hadn't admitted that to myself until my therapist, a quiet, careful woman named Dr. Walsh, asked me to describe my relationship with my parents. And I spent about 20 minutes doing it, and at the end she said, "It sounds like you're very angry with them." And I realized, sitting there, that she was right. I was furious, not in a way that was on the surface, not in a way that was showing up in my daily life in obvious ways. I wasn't calling them to argue, I wasn't dwelling on it consciously. I had built a whole system of busyness and forward motion designed to keep me from sitting with it. But underneath all of that motion was an enormous amount of anger at two people who had laughed at me when I needed them not to laugh at me, and who had never, not once in the years since that Thanksgiving, asked a genuine question about what I was building. Working through that anger was some of the hardest work I did during those years. I'm not going to pretend it got resolved cleanly, the way things get resolved in movies. It didn't. It shifted. I stopped carrying it the same way. I got to a place where I could understand, without approving of, how my parents had arrived at their fixed idea of who I was and what I was capable of. They had their own limitations, their own fears, their own frameworks for understanding the world. Those frameworks had no room for what I was doing, and rather than expand the framework, they had contracted it and labeled me accordingly. Understanding that didn't make it not hurt, but it made it a little easier to set down. I kept going to therapy, on and off, for the next several years. I still go, occasionally. I think it's worth mentioning because these stories, the success stories, the proof them wrong stories, tend to present themselves as purely external journeys, as if the obstacle was always out there in the world, rather than partly inside your own head. For me, both were true, and addressing the inside part was just as necessary as addressing the outside part. Years 4 and 5. The refinance capital from Riverside Terrace gave me a runway. Not a fortune, not enough to retire on, not enough to move fast, but enough to operate differently than I had before. I used part of it to pay off the rest of my consumer debt. I put a significant portion back into reserves, and I started looking for the next deal. I found it in year 4, a 38-lot community in southern Michigan, similar profile to Riverside Terrace, distressed, underperforming, owned by someone who had stopped paying close attention to it. The price reflected the neglect. Dennis and I looked at it together. He passed. He had other things he was focused on, but he encouraged me to pursue it, and this time I found my own capital partner, a woman from the investor meetup named Christine, who had been doing residential rental investing for 8 years and was looking to diversify into commercial. Christine and I spent 3 weeks doing due diligence on the Michigan property. We hired an independent inspector. We reviewed 3 years of utility records and tax filings. We talked to current residents. We walked every inch of the property twice. At the end of it, we made an offer 15% below asking price. And we held the line when the seller countered. And eventually we got within 10% of our original offer. We closed in February. The Michigan turnaround was harder than Indiana in some ways, and easier in others. Harder because the infrastructure was more deeply degraded. We had to replace a significant section of the water line, which was expensive and disruptive, and required coordinating with the county utility authority, which is a bureaucratic adventure I would not wish on anyone. Easier because I was more experienced now. I made fewer mistakes. I moved faster on the things that needed to move fast, and was more patient on the things that required patience. By month 15, Michigan was performing well. Better than Indiana at the same point. Christine and I refinanced 18 months after acquisition. The returns were strong enough that she called me afterward and said, "What's the next one?" I was building a portfolio. I was also, during this period, beginning to understand something about myself that I hadn't fully understood before. I was good at this. Not just competent, genuinely good. The operational side, the financial analysis, the relationship with residents and contractors and local officials, the patience required to improve something slowly rather than demanding immediate results. All of it came naturally to me in a way that other things never had. The jobs I had lost in my early 20s, the ones that left me feeling like I was always slightly misaligned with what was expected of me, those were the right jobs actually. They were right for me in the sense that failing at them had forced me to find the thing I was actually built for. I thought about that sometimes. I thought about how often the narrative around failure is that it's something you overcome, something you leave behind. I didn't feel that way about my early layoffs. I felt like they were the necessary preconditions for everything that followed. That if I had held on to one of those jobs, if I had ground my way into stability the way my father would have wanted, I would have been stable and wrong, safe and misaligned. Year 6. A few things happened in year 6 that I want to tell you about. First, I bought out Christine's share of the Michigan property. She was moving in a different direction. She had found a larger multifamily opportunity she wanted to pursue, and the terms were fair. I now owned the Michigan property outright, or as outright as any mortgaged property can be owned. Second, Dennis had a health scare, a cardiac event in May, not a heart attack technically, but close enough that his doctors started talking about lifestyle changes, and his wife started talking about slowing down. He was 64 by now. He was not interested in slowing down, but he was beginning to think about his portfolio differently, about what he wanted to hold versus what he was ready to let go of. He called me in June and asked if I would be interested in acquiring one of his parks, a 42-lot community in rural Ohio, about 90 minutes from Columbus. Solid operational history, stable occupancy, no major deferred maintenance. More expensive than anything I had purchased before, but also more immediately productive. No turnaround required, just steady management. This was the conversation I'd been building toward for 6 years without knowing it. Not this specific deal. I couldn't have predicted this specific deal. But this type of moment, the moment when the work you'd done accumulated into the ability to say yes to something significant. We spent 2 months negotiating the terms. Dennis gave me a fair price, not a gift, I want to be clear. He was not giving anything away, but the terms were structured in a way that worked for where I was financially, with seller financing on a portion of the acquisition that reduced my upfront capital requirement. I brought in one new capital partner, a physician from Cincinnati, who had been looking for passive real estate investment opportunities and came to me through Christine's network. The acquisition closed in September of year 6. I now had 3 properties, Indiana, Michigan, and Ohio, a total of 112 lots. Combined occupancy in the mid-80s, trending upward. Monthly net income that had crossed a threshold, not a dramatic threshold, but a meaningful one, where it was clear that this was no longer a side project alongside a day job. This was the thing. In October of year 6, I resigned from the property management company. My boss, a decent man who had given me real opportunities, said he wasn't surprised. He said he had been wondering how long I was going to stay. He shook my hand and said good luck. And I drove home feeling a feeling I don't have a precise word for. The feeling of stepping fully into something, of removing the last remaining safety net. I called my parents that night. My mom answered. I told her I had left my job to focus on my real estate business full-time. There was a pause. Is that wise? She said. In this economy? I think so, I said. Your father thinks you should have something stable to fall back on. I know he does, I said. We talked for a few more minutes, and then we hung up. My father never came on the line. I don't know if he was in the other room and chose not to, or if he simply wasn't home. I didn't ask. Years 7, 8, and 9. I want to move through these years a little faster, not because they were unimportant, but because the patterns in them were similar to what came before. Identify distressed asset, conduct thorough due diligence, structure acquisition, execute operational improvement, stabilize, hold, or refinance. The engine was running the same way, just at a higher capacity. In year 7, I acquired a 28-lot park in Kentucky. This was my first acquisition without a capital partner. I financed it entirely through the equity I had accumulated in my existing properties, and a conventional commercial loan. It went well. The turnaround was 18 months. In year 8, 2 things of note. First, I brought on a full-time property manager, a woman named Alicia, who had been working in mobile home park management for 11 years, and was, frankly, better at the day-to-day operational details than I was. Hiring Alicia was one of the best decisions I made in this entire period, because it freed me to focus on what I was actually best at. Second, in year 8, I sold the Indiana property Riverside Terrace, the first one, the one Dennis and I had turned around together. The market conditions were right, and the return on that original investment, when we finally realized it through the sale, was significant. I'll put a number to it. I turned my initial $22,000 into something in the neighborhood of $180,000 over 6 years, accounting for the refinance proceeds and the final sale. Year 9 was the year I finally had the conversation with my father. It happened in June. I was visiting Columbus for an unrelated meeting, and on an impulse, I called and asked if I could stop by the house for dinner. My mother said yes without hesitation. My father said, on the extension, that they'd see me at 6. I drove out to the suburb where I'd grown up. The house was the same. The carpet was still brown. The television was still on, when nobody was watching it. My mom had made a pot roast. We ate at the same table where that Thanksgiving dinner had happened, now 9 years past. After dinner, my mom went to the kitchen to deal with the dishes. She's old-fashioned that way. She doesn't like people helping. And my dad and I sat at the table with our coffee cups, and there was a silence that had been building for 9 years, and I decided to walk into it. "I want to talk about something," I said. My dad set down his cup. His expression was careful, the expression of a person who suspects they're about to be confronted with something. "What you said at Thanksgiving, 9 years ago," I said, "about the trailer park." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I don't remember exactly what I said." "You said I'd end up in a trailer park one way or another. Might as well own one." He looked at his coffee cup. "You laughed," I said. "The whole table laughed." "We weren't trying to be cruel," he said. "I know," I said. "I think you believed it, and you thought it was funny because you believed it, and you never thought to check whether it was true." He didn't say anything. "I own 3 mobile home communities," I said. 142 lots. In Ohio, Michigan, and Kentucky. I have a 4th one under contract in Indiana. My annual net operating income last year was, I told him the number. It was a number that would have meant something to him. It did mean something. I could see it on his face. He was quiet for a long time. "I didn't know," he said finally. "You didn't ask," I said. That was all I said about it. I didn't press further, didn't demand acknowledgement or apology or any particular response. I had not driven out there to win an argument. I had driven out there because I needed him to know, not as a performance, not for anyone else's benefit, but because carrying a secret for 9 years turns it into something it was never supposed to be, and I was tired of carrying it. He nodded slowly. Then he said, "Your grandfather was in construction. Did I ever tell you that?" He hadn't, not in any meaningful way. "He built things," my dad said, "from nothing." He was proud of that. He picked up his coffee cup. "I think maybe I should have told you that story more," he said. That was as close as he came to an apology. It was also, I understood in that moment, as close as he was capable of getting, given who he was and how he was built. I nodded. We talked for another half hour about things that weren't that. The markets, some local news, a renovation he was thinking about doing on the back porch. When I left, he stood in the doorway and said in a tone I don't think I had ever heard from him before, "You did good." I drove home and did not cry until I was on the highway. And then I cried for about 15 minutes, which surprised me, because I had thought I was past that. I wasn't past it. I was just further along. Year 10. Year 10 was mostly about consolidation and preparation. I had been watching the Arizona market for 2 years, specifically the Phoenix metro and surrounding areas, which were seeing population inflows that made affordable housing, including mobile home communities, an increasingly constrained resource. I had identified several properties in Maricopa County that fit my acquisition criteria. I had been running numbers, building relationships with local brokers, attending regional real estate events. I had also, over the past several years, been building my personal capital base to a point where I could pursue a larger acquisition without a capital partner. Not because I was opposed to partnerships. Christine and I still had an ongoing relationship and would do another deal together eventually, but because I wanted to know that I could. I wanted the full closing, the full responsibility, the full ownership. The property I had been watching most closely was Sycamore Ridge. Sycamore Ridge Mobile Home Community sat on 42 acres in Maricopa County, about 40 minutes from downtown Phoenix. 47 lots. Occupancy at the time I started watching it was hovering around 78%, below where it should be for a property in that location, which told me there was an operational story there. The infrastructure was aging, but not failing. The ownership was a partnership that had been fractured for several years by disagreement among the partners, which was creating decision paralysis and allowing the property to drift. A property in drift is a property with room to improve. That's what I looked for. I made contact with the ownership group through a broker in Phoenix. The initial conversations were cautious. Distressed partnership situations tend to be complicated, with competing agendas among the partners that can make negotiation unpredictable. I was patient. I let the conversations develop at their own pace. I sent an initial offer in March of year 10, fully expecting to be countered or rejected. We negotiated for 4 months. In year 11, in November, almost exactly 11 years after that Thanksgiving dinner, I sat in a conference room in Phoenix and signed the closing documents on Sycamore Ridge Mobile Home Community. 47 lots, just like the post-it note said. I took a photo of the signed documents. I sent it to Dennis. He replied with 2 words, "Knew it." I sent a photo to Alicia, who replied with a series of exclamation points. I did not send it to my parents. I drove out to the property that afternoon. I walked the lots in the November sun, which in Arizona is warm and direct, and nothing like the gray November cold of Ohio. I walked slowly, the way I had walked that first distressed property in Indiana 8 years before, making mental notes, looking at what was there and imagining what it would become. And at some point, standing in the middle of Lot 23, on a piece of land I now owned in a state I had never lived in before, I thought about my father at that Thanksgiving table. I thought about the laugh. I thought about the specific quality of casual dismissal in his voice, the way it required no effort, the way it cost him nothing. And I thought about the post-it note, Trailer Park, 47 lots, Arizona. I had written it at 22, on a night when I was angry and scared and more alone than I wanted to admit. I had written it not because I actually believed it would happen. I think if you had asked me honestly that night, I would have admitted that I had no idea if it would happen, but because I needed something to aim at. I needed to take their dismissal and turn it into a direction. And here I was, at Lot 23, in Arizona. 11 years later. I didn't feel triumphant exactly. I want to be honest about that. The movies always show this moment as a triumph. Swelling music, clenched fist, tears of victory. That's not quite what I felt. What I felt was quieter than that. It was more like completion, like a long sentence had finally reached its period. I took out my phone and dialed. My mom answered on the 3rd ring. "Hey," I said. "Is Dad around?" "He's in the garage," she said. "Hold on." I heard her call for him. I heard his footsteps. I heard the phone change hands. "Yeah?" he said. "I just wanted to tell you something," I said. "I closed on a property today. In Arizona." "Oh yeah?" His voice had something in it that I had learned to recognize over the past few years, a kind of cautious openness, a willingness to engage that hadn't always been there. "How big?" 47 lots, I said. There was a pause. "Mobile homes," he said. "Mobile homes," I said. Another pause. I waited. "That's the one you've been working on," he said. He remembered. I had mentioned it in passing at Christmas, and he had remembered. "That's the one," I said. "Good," he said. "That's real good." We talked for about 10 minutes. Practical things mostly. He asked about the condition of the property, about the market in Arizona, about whether I thought Phoenix was going to keep growing the way people said. My dad's interest in things is almost always practical. I had learned to find that comforting rather than frustrating. When we were wrapping up, he said, "You know your grandfather, my dad, he used to say the best investment you can make is in something people always need. Shelter, food, things like that." "He sounds smart," I said. "He was," my dad said. And there was something in his voice, something I had spent a lot of years wanting to hear, and had mostly stopped expecting, that I recognized as pride. Not just pride in his father, pride in me. I said good night and hung up, and stood on my 47 lots in the Arizona sun, and let that feeling exist for a minute before I started taking photos for the property file. I want to finish by talking about the post-it note, because people always ask about it. It's still on my monitor. Not the same physical post-it. That paper is long gone, yellowed and stuck, and eventually lost in one of my moves. But I have written it on a new one, identical, and it has been on every monitor I have owned since that first night, a constant in every apartment and office I have worked in, through all the years in between. Trailer park. 47 lots. Arizona. People who come into my office and see it usually assume it's a reminder about a current deal or some kind of target I'm working toward. I let them assume that. The full explanation takes too long, and also it's mine. It belongs to me in a way that I don't feel like sharing casually. What I will tell you is what it represents, which is simpler than the story. It represents the decision I made on that cold Ohio night to take someone else's contempt and turn it into a compass, to use the thing that was meant to diminish me as the thing that directed me, to make their certainty that I would fail into my own certainty that I would not. That's it. That's the whole thing. It's not complicated. It's just hard, and long, and quiet in the middle in ways that nobody films, because the middle is not dramatic. It's just year after year of showing up and doing the work, and not quitting when it would have been easier to quit, which was often. My portfolio today includes Sycamore Ridge and 4 other communities, 312 lots across 5 states. I have a team of 5 people. I have a business that my 22-year-old self could not have imagined in any specific detail, only in the blurry, stubborn, irrational way that you imagine things when you need to believe in them more than you can justify. My dad came to visit Arizona last spring, first time he had ever been to the Southwest. I drove him out to Sycamore Ridge on a Sunday morning. He stood at the entrance for a moment, looking at the sign, looking at the rows of homes, looking at the families out in their yards in the early sun. Then he turned to me and said, "You did all this?" "I did all this," I said. He nodded for a long time without saying anything. Then he put his hand on my shoulder, briefly, once, the way men of his generation do it when they mean something bigger than the gesture, and said, "Your grandfather would have liked to." I'll take it. If you made it to the end of this story, thank you for listening. If any part of it felt familiar, if you've ever sat at a table while someone told you what you were and what you weren't, then I want you to know that the table is not the whole story. It's just the beginning of one. Write it down, whatever they said. Put it somewhere you can see it. Then go prove them wrong the quiet way, the slow way, the real way. It takes longer than you think. It works better than you expect. And one day, on an afternoon you can almost see from here, you'll be standing on your 47 lots in the November sun, and the only thing you'll feel is complete. Thank you for watching. Subscribe if you want to hear what happens next. And if this story hit home, leave a comment.